Any objections? Yes.
That's some objection. One of the more common objections I get is from other people who consider themselves to be atheists. And they almost see humanism as an assault on the rights of individuals to enjoy religion, that by questioning the privilege of religion, you are essentially attacking those lovely old ladies and those masters. They don't see us as questioning privilege, they see us as discriminating against religion. So how do you, I think that's of course a fundamental question, because these people are atheists, they're not humanists. How would you answer that question to them? How would you get them on board with humanism?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I think you're right to highlight the fact that it is often non-religious people, atheists or whatever, who feel that somehow religion ought to be given an easier ride than many humanists are willing to give it. I think that... No, it's wine, not water. I've got all my water left. All my water's left. No, it doesn't work. Okay. Not enough former Christians in the house, obviously, to get that. Where was I? Yes. Yeah, okay. So there are many factors, I think, that go to people having this attitude, an attitude that can be very damaging. I think that the way that one ought to take it on is to start from an assessment of religion as nothing special in the great social order of things, but a human set of ideas, a human creation like anything else. I think if you take a humanist view of life, the universe and everything, then you have to accept that one of the ways in which people get their sense of meaning in life is through religions. Religions are a human creation that for many human beings has great importance. And I think it's a moot question as to how we should, how one therefore wants to engage with people who are religious but whose religion is not doing any harm. But a second question is how you want to engage with religious ideas that are extremely harmful, and especially social institutions, which are religious institutions, which are extremely harmful. And then I think you shouldn't pull any punches, any more punches that you would pull if you were engaging with fascist institutions, or totalitarian, or inhumanly communist institutions, or racist institutions or ideas. I think because these ideas are human creations and because we acknowledge them as such and diagnose them as such, we should not give them any special allure or mystique, not allow them to have any uniquely protected status. And I think very often the sort of people that you're talking about are according them a uniquely protected status. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes the people that you're talking about would also not take on other people's unsavoury political views, but far less often than they would not take on people's unsavoury religious views. I think context is everything. If your dying grandmother, 45 seconds from the end, looks into your eyes and says, "Tell me, Andrew," in my case, "Tell me, Andrew, you do believe I'll see your granddad, don't you? You do really believe that, don't you, really, even though everything you've said?" I will say yes. Yes, Grandma, I do. Thankfully, she's a thoroughgoing humanist, so it's not going to happen. But if it did, I wouldn't hesitate. If, she were a little way from that point, as hopefully she is, and were advancing these views in a way that, I thought was wrong, and that might be leading her down the garden path intellectually, or might lead to harmful social consequences because she goes out and votes for the Christian party that are standing in her local election, or takes a dim view of other people's behaviour that it's perfectly fine, then I respect her, so I'll engage with her. And because I respect her, I'll tell her how stupid I think she's being, and try, not in that way, she's my grandmother, but, engage with her in an attempt to convince her that she's wrong. She might convince me I'm wrong, of course, that's always the risk when you engage with other people, but I'd have a go. And I think it's really part of respecting another human being that you take their ideas seriously and therefore take them on if you disagree with them. And I've had religious friends myself in the past with whom I've engaged in the same way that I engage with friends who have stupid political views, on that basis, because I respect them. And I think that's the attitude that we should cultivate. It's not a complete answer to your question, because of course there might be lots of different reasons why people have this exaggerated regard for religious ideas, but I think it's my attitude. Yes?
Should we force everyone to make gay cakes? Or should they be allowed to say no? I'm referring specifically to the baker who refused to make a cake that supported gay marriage, and they've been found against.
Yes, I think that if you're providing that there's a genuine distinction, which is becoming old-fashioned, and we need to stand up against it becoming old-fashioned, because it's a genuine distinction which the stability of society, especially of a tolerant and plural society, depends on. There's a genuine distinction between our private lives and our public lives. And when you are in the public realm, when you're in the public sphere, and when you're offering a commercial service, you are firmly in that sphere, then you have to offer that service impartially, I think. You have to offer that service in a way that is compatible and compliant with the law of the land or whatever jurisdiction you find yourself in, as long as its law has been developed democratically with the rule of law and in accordance with human rights. And so I think that if you offer a service like the making of cakes, then you have to offer it impartially. In your private life, you can go home and say, fucking gay marriage, how awful, how disgusting. And by all means, you shouldn't have one if you feel that way about gay marriage. But you definitely need to bake that cake, or stop baking cakes for the public.
Does that mean that if you're a gay bakery and someone demands that you bake a cake with the words homosexuals wallow in their own filth, that you should be equally required to do so?
Yes, I think so. But misspell it. In pink icing.
I think that there's a distinction between freedom of expression, the right to say what you want to say, and how media for doing it, and the obligation to express someone else's opinion with which you don't agree.
I think that the public-private distinction is in play. I mean, I think that if you're a banner maker or a sign maker or a cake baker or whatever, offering a service to the public, and the person who is asking you to put a message out there is not asking you to put an unlawful message out there, an illegal message out there, then I think that you should provide that service which you've entered the public square to provide. And I think, well, people feel very sensitive these days about their own views and their own sort of identities and their own positions. But the fact is, if you're out there providing a service, well, suck it up. I mean, it's the world you live in. Not everyone's going to agree with you, and I'm sorry, but freedom depends on you being insulted as much as anyone being insulted. And sometimes having to do things that might go against your beliefs, because you live in a society where your beliefs aren't the dictator over everyone. I mean, I think that's perfectly appropriate. I don't mind.
No, it occurs to me that people thinking about this. They're disobeying their own leaders' advice, which is to go for second life. And I thought if I was people was a baker, if someone came in and asked me to bake a cake with the words "Jesus saves," I would do it. And I would spend it right. I would do it for the best 5 minutes too.
Good for you. And you're a better person for that, I believe. I find it difficult to see everybody because of the light, not because of the wine. And as a result, I might not be the best chair. Would someone like to come and choose the questions for? I mean, you're next, obviously, but maybe after that someone could.
Hi everyone, sorry I was late. Just about the gay cake, I think that it would be illegal to refuse someone a service because they're gay, or because they're black, or because they're anything. But like to put a message and to force people to put a message, whatever Jesus says or anything supporting gay marriage, I'm not very sure about that.
Well, can I just question, just first of all, I mean, force people to do it. If you're advertising a service to the public where you pipe messages onto cakes, and someone comes and wants a message, you're hardly forcing people to do it. They've offered up their services to the public, and you're a member of the public wanting that service. And I think it's actually very dangerous, this idea of coercion that's entered the discussion on this topic, because increasingly in a large number of jurisdictions, especially in the Western world, this idea of coercion of religious people to do things against their precious consciences is coming into debate. And even some otherwise well-intentioned secular people are saying, oh, well, we don't want to be rude, we don't want to be mean. That is not what is happening. This is what's known as a wedge strategy. By quite well-funded Christian and other religious groups who are exploiting the idea of conscientious exemption in an attempt to dilute equality laws. And we've seen where that can go. There was a whole swathe of attempts to invoke conscientious objection against abortion by doctors in Belgium. And what started off as a very innocent attempt to allow individuals their conscientious objection ended up in denying women in a whole region of that country access to an abortion. So I think there are many, many factors that need to be weighed when exploring questions of conscientious exemption. The BHA has a great pamphlet called something, Right to Object, question mark, which sort of engages with the question of conscientious objection and concludes that there are 17 factors that you have to take into account when you're assessing whether or not to grant someone a conscientious exemption in the law. Well, that's quite a lot of factors, and it illustrates, I think, how complicated an area this is. Very unwise to reduce it to questions of two warring parties and elements of coercion. And certainly, people who enter the public square to provide a service are not being forced to do anything if that's the service they volunteered to provide. What was your question?
Yeah, you're right about that. If they offer to press private messages or things, yeah, I might reconsider my position. I don't have I think objections to humanism. I don't have objections to humanism as a life sentence, as I'm a humanist myself. But I think humanism in practice, it suffers a lot of problems. And I think one of the major problems of humanism is always it addresses religious people, which basically I think it's based on the assumption that atheists are by default humanists. And I would like to see more content that is addressed to atheists and secularists and other people that are not religious, but they know about death, and they don't fear death, and they know that the meaning doesn't come from religious books, but they agree on other things. And I think pseudoscience is a very good thing that the BHA is doing, because a lot of people that do not believe in deities in general, but they do believe in pseudoscience. I think the other thing as well is to highlight that humanists are like any other group. And I think more humanists than any other group, as humanism is about rational skepticism with the heart and with philanthropy. We should stress our differences. And I think this is a very good point to stress our differences. And I feel a bit, I feel sad when I see that we still in the point that we still in everything that we agree on, and we don't explore the things that we don't really agree on. And this is a very important point that I would like to see more and more events with a humanist versus a humanist about any issue. Right. I'll give an example about humanist marriages that I think I would more like to see other people who like humanist civil unions, or maybe secular marriages, and then you can celebrate forever. Thank you.
Great. So the first part of your question, I think about addressing non-religious people as the audience. Actually, I struggle to think of a humanist organisation in the world that defines its audience as the religious. I mean, the BHA in its own aims and strategies, which you can see on our website, is all about speaking to the non-religious. And in fact, the sort of objection you've just made is more often made to me the other way around. We're more often asked at the office why we aren't doing more to carry the message into religious sort of groups and communities. The argument that we make back is always that 51% of people in Britain are non-religious, so we've got enough to be getting on with telling them about humanism than we have before we start to go off to these others who are going to be, by their nature, more resistant. So I think that actually the function of humanist organisations, as distinct from the idea of humanism as propounded by individuals, humanist organisations are almost always targeting their social efforts, their social and intellectual efforts at non-religious people. So, I mean, the first aim of the BHA is that we want non-religious people to be confident in living ethical and fulfilling lives on the basis of reason and humanity. And we're all about addressing non-religious people to give them that message and to bring that message to them. Your beliefs are not second-rate. They are not derivative from a religious past. They are not incoherent. They're a coherent set of beliefs and values that not only have immense importance to you and immense social effects today, which are highly beneficial, but have inspired some of the greatest thinkers and doers in the history of humanity. That's very much a message for the non-religious. Our social services in terms of ceremonies and pastoral support in prisons and hospitals and elsewhere are also targeted absolutely at the non-religious. Our political advocacy is targeted not just at the non-religious, but it's only targeted at the religious coincidentally because they happen to be lawmakers or in government or in some other position of power. So I think the only area of work that the BHA gets involved in that is targeted, as it were, specifically at religious people is the work we get involved in terms of dialogue. Dialogue with religious individuals and religious groups, where again the aim is to have humanism understood, but by religious people rather than by non-religious people. So I think that in the world generally, humanist organisations, as distinct perhaps from a few famous humanist individuals, tailor their message and direct their efforts primarily towards the non-religious, who after all are a growing demographic that, as I say, gives us enough to be getting on with. The second point about internal diversity I think is very interesting and very important. I think we're reaching the point now, especially in Europe, where the non-religious category is becoming within itself so diverse and so broad that there is a question of difference within that demographic that needs to be addressed. I mean, it was not long ago that you could reliably assume that every person who ticked no religion on a form, a survey or opinion poll in the UK was what we would describe as a humanist according to the post hoc definition that we've given today. That's not true anymore. I mean, there are interesting opinion polls and social attitude surveys that look at what the people who tick no religion believe, and it is still the case that about 80% of them are what we would call humanists if we were going by the definition here. But that 20% is really interesting. It's full of people who believe in angels and crystals and life after death, and homeopathy. You know, it's full of people like that. It's full of people who don't think that, you know, the adoption of moral values based on humanity is important. You know, there are people in there who think that, you know, might is right, and, you know, the weakest to the wall, and everyone else, you know, live by your efforts read in tooth and claw. You know, they are real people within that no religion demographic. That diversity within the non-religious is extremely important. Diverse, and they're the audience that I was talking about addressing, really, when I was talking about addressing non-religious people. They're an important audience for us. The idea of diversity amongst humanists is equally interesting. I think, you know, I mean, I agree with you that to discuss difference and to share ideas is an important part of any social movement, and that should happen internally as much as externally. I think currently there is not the measure of divergence within that would justify that as a priority. Think of something like assisted dying. 93% of non-religious people are in favour of assisted dying. There's nothing like the division of opinion that there is amongst religious people overall. Quite a lot of social issues are like that. Take humanist marriage. I mean, there are plenty of people who would say, well, it would be better if the state just had civil marriages, and you know, I prefer that, but the actual fact is that's not going to happen, and therefore, you know, religious marriages will always be with us, and so we should also have humanist marriage. And there are also people who would say, well, I don't think the state should be the only people who are doing legal marriages. Religious groups can, why can't they, whatever, and humanist groups should too. But I don't think it's sufficient of a difference or sufficiently bipolar of a difference to mean that we want to spend too much time discussing that. Internally with humanist organisations, of course, not just in Britain but around the world, and internationally in terms of the international humanist organisations, there are enormous policy discussions that happen internally where there is a wide range of opinion. In Norway, for example, the Norwegian Humanist Association decided not to take a position on assisted dying in Norway because their membership was split radically. You know, right down the middle, well, maybe not right down the middle, more in favour than against perhaps, but, you know, sufficiently split to mean that that policy wasn't appropriate to adopt. And I think those sort of conversations do happen healthily within organisations. Public events where there is a difference are also useful, but I think you have to work hard for them not to be false distinctions. You know, you have a debate between a philosopher and a novelist, as we've had, about which is best, you know, for promoting good morality, literature or philosophy. And people will give sort of spirited defences either way. But, you know, 98% of the humanists in the audience will say, no, I agree with both. I see both sides of that argument. And, you know, if you're the sort of person, and obviously most humanists are, who do say, oh, it is complicated, oh, there is argument here and an argument there, and we have to do the best we can in this messy, complicated situation, then I think that dialogue is perhaps more interesting than debate, and discussion, and the representation of a broad range of views, rather than the clashing of two opposing views within a single group. Any other objections? Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of people I've spoken to seem to think that humanists are kind of killjoys when it comes to religious holidays. But if we
Religious
take part-
holidays?
Religious holidays, Christmas being a good example. But if we do take part in those religious holidays, does it mean we're hypocrites?
Well, I think we should have more religious holidays, by which I mean holidays, because I think that, you know, at the moment we only have Christian holidays in this country. If you lived in South Korea, has anyone ever lived in South Korea? If you live in South Korea, and I know this because my friend worked for the South Korean embassy in London, you get the holidays of every religion off for free. You get the Christian ones and the Buddhist ones, then you get them all. I think we should have that. So more holidays is my opinion. More joy, less killing, and more holidays. And let's have Christmas every year. I mean, okay, so is what you're really talking about, you know, people celebrating Christmas? Yeah, exactly. So you do get that. You get sort of like, oh, if you're a humanist, why aren't you in the office on the 25th of December? You know, well, because I've been born in Western Europe at a time when the whole cultural calendar is massively influenced by centuries of, you know, pagan winter festivals, which... and so I like to have it off at that time of year. But, you know, and that's the same argument, you know, around the world in all sorts of cultures. So I think the best way, actually, because it really annoys them, is to go for that angle and say, well, I celebrate it for the same reason that you do, you know, because centuries of culture have brought you to this point. Killjoys. That's what I would say to them. And maybe you want to make a few observations about how much better your way of celebrating is, because it doesn't locate the joy outside of humanity, but is about friends and family and giving and warmth and food and joy. Then see what they say about that. And then film their reactions and upload it to the Galha website. Chris?
Just on the objections to humanism from lawmakers, I was wondering if that's on mind. Did you have any views on the election results from 2 weeks ago?
Well, the BHA is a charity, and so is not able to be party political, and as its representative, I wouldn't seek to do so. Before the election, we produced 2 graphics, which demonstrated what the different parties' policies were in relation to core humanist issues, and how and then a second graphic which showed how the political parties had committed to voting in Parliament on these issues, which are 2 different things, because a party might have the right policy but not vote to implement it. I don't want to make a party political point, but suffice it to say that the party that had the least humanist policies in both those graphics is the party that won the general election and has formed the government. Now, that does not mean that in the next 5 years we are totally without hope. There are the Conservative Party in its manifesto, and indeed the Conservative government, has a strong commitment to freedom of belief internationally. The Conservative Party was the only party that put in its manifesto the rights of non-religious people abroad, right? So none of the other party manifestos did that. Labour didn't do it. They talked about the rights of religious people abroad. They didn't talk about the rights of non-religious people abroad. The Conservative Party was the only party that said that they would appoint a global envoy that dealt not just with religious freedom in the world, but the freedom of non-religious people to, you know, have their freedom in other countries. That's something that we've worked a lot with the Foreign Commonwealth Office about, and the ministers there have always been extremely supportive, and the UK has been very good at promoting freedom of religion or belief as being a right that affects the non-religious as much as anything else. The Conservative government is also the government that instructed the Law Commission to investigate marriage law. So humanist marriage was not given legal recognition in the last Parliament. It is true that the Labour, Lib Dem and Green parties were all in favour of giving it immediate legal recognition had they come into power, but the Conservative Party did not rule it out. They simply referred the matter to the Law Commission, and the Law Commission will report at the end of this year on that matter, and it may well be that a Conservative government is willing to give recognition to that. The Conservative ministers in the previous government were better than the Labour government before it had been in tackling creationism in state schools. The Labour government had refused to rule out and to ban the teaching of creationism. in state schools, although they'd issued non-statutory guidance against it. The Conservative-led Department for Education in the last government took the step to actually ban it.
Would that have been notified by free schools, though, the freedom of curriculum?
No, they took the step to ban it in free schools. That's what the Conservative government did. They wrote into the free school agreement, the academy agreement, that there must be no creationism. So they were much firmer than their predecessors. So there are politics. I mean, every political party has its good points and its bad points, and there's also a difference between what political parties put in their policy and to what extent they're driven by events. Now, the Conservative Party is a lot more driven by events than it is by its own policy, because unlike other parties, it doesn't have a policy-making mechanism, for example, in its annual conference. Whereas the Lib Dem and Green Party, they've got a lot of policy. You know? Lib Dems and Greens Party came out best on our graphic in terms of policies because they've got progressive members who pass very progressive policies on the conference floor every year. But their MPs don't always vote for it in Parliament when they're given the chance, and their governments don't always implement it. So, we'll wait and see. Also, I think that another reason not to be too down at the fact that the party with the least humanist policies forms a government is that political lobbying and parliamentary and government work with Parliament and government is not the only way that a movement can achieve its aims. I mean, this year we're taking legal action against the government because of its exclusion from non-religious philosophy, of non-religious philosophies from GCSE. We can go through the courts to try and get redress for that. You don't have to go through parliamentarians. We're also taking legal action to try and challenge the prohibition on assisted dying. That's legal action. It doesn't go through government and parliament. It goes through the courts. And of course, we're out there all the time expanding our reach into people's lives in terms of ceremonies, pastoral support in prisons and hospitals, speakers in schools, teaching increasing numbers of young people about non-religious philosophies. So there's a lot you can do, even in a very hostile political environment, as we will probably be facing in the next 5 years, to nonetheless advance our aims. And you end up maybe 5 years down the line a stronger, more unified, more coherent movement with better resources than you were before, because you've had that time to develop. And on that note...
Are there any other ways you would wind up now? A massive round of applause and thank you.
Thank you.